Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where we all know I'm a bit of a fan of the Amiga. And I figured it was time for us to take a look at my favourite titles for the machine. But not just any old games, we're looking at the exclusives, the games you couldn't get anywhere else. So, in no particular order, let's get started. And first up is the second Samurai. A game I first played via a cover disc, and after playing that many times, as well as enjoying screenshots in the magazine, it was unfortunately some time before I got to play the full thing. But it was great, as it's a mix of a side-scrolling beat-em-up and platformer, in which you play as one of two samurais, or both can be played at once in two-player co-op. If you played the first Samurai, then you might have an idea of what to expect, but it does feel like they might have simplified things a little bit, as it's more straightforward, as while the levels are still quite large, they are more linear. But they tried to make it more interesting with mid-level bosses, hidden areas to access, and trying to change up the gameplay, all of which is just on the first level. It's a game that starts on this very moody world, with some lovely fire effects going on, and mixes up the types of area that you'll end up visiting, with lots of weird and wonderful baddies and bosses to fight, as well as some very futuristic elements showing up later, including a jetpack. Your main weapon is a sword that you'll have to collect, but be careful as it is possible to lose it again, which will then limit you down to basic punch and kicks. But there are other items that you can find and use, like daggers that you can throw. So there is a lot to this game, and it's always been inventive. There was also an updated AGA version that mostly expanded on the backgrounds, which already looked great, so they might not have been needed. But it is quite nice to have. But the main reason to go for this version is that the original, well, it had issues on the AGA machines. There was a game with the same name released on the Mega Drive, but outside of it using two samurais, the games are quite different, so I think it still fits in the theme of this episode. Oh no, my god! Let's look at a channel favourite next with Ruff N Tumble. Another game that I played the demo of possibly more than the final release. And this too required waiting a good number of years to see what was past those first few levels. But it was worth it. You play as Rough Rogers, who has to get his marbles back. You and me both, mate. But you have quite the range of firepower to take on the tin bots that are trying to get in your way. From the starting machine gun, that can be a little weak to start off with, to the heavy machine guns, and lasers, rocket launchers, and even flamethrowers. Plus, you can find upgrades to your health, as you can add a few extra hearts to your max amount. So this ends up being a cross between a Euro platformer and a run and gun, as the levels tend to be quite large and have quite a few ways for you to explore them. And just look at these levels, they are absolutely lovely. From going into the darkened caves, to later travelling underwater. Now if it feels like you've seen a number of these games before, then you have. And while the Amiga did get quite a few exclusive games, the ones that most people tend to think about as Amiga titles, or at least are their favourites, ended up being ported to other platforms, or even started on another machine first, which means you have to go digging a bit to find those truly Amiga only titles, that at least were commercially released anyway. Returning to the graphics that I mentioned, these are actually running on an original Amiga, well, as long as you have 1MB of RAM, but that was pretty much standard at the time of release. Now it would have been nice to have seen an A1200 edition, as I think they could have smoothed the frame rate out a little bit. But that's something you tend to notice more in the watching than in the playing, as you're having so much fun with all the weapons and the targets and everything that you don't really notice it. And because you're playing across varied worlds, each with their own baddies and bosses that you have to deal with, it's just amazing. It's a game that at some point I have to have in my collection. We're going to need to clear out some viruses, so send for the Virocop. Now this is a game I remember seeing in the magazines back in the day, but like so many others, I never really got a chance to play it at the time, as this was quite late in the Amiga's history, and the amount of Amiga games in the shops, well, it was starting to thin out a little bit. And that might have been why this was the last game that Graph Gold made for the Amiga. This is a top-down scrolling shooter, in which the Virocop, Dave, has been sent in to various game sectors to clear out the viruses that have taken hold. And because of this, we play across multiple themed worlds, all of which look quite lovely on an original machine, or on the AGA ones with its updated edition. And with its 3/4 perspective linked to the past style look to it, the game also plays with height, as you have to use these ramps to get up to the higher areas, but you can also fall down to the lower ones just as easily. Now each level has a number of viruses that you'll have to take out. Now these are typically quite easy to spot as they're big, green and with tentacle-like things on them. But thankfully you can use the level designs to your advantage to attack them, as well as the other baddies that you might come across. Now these attacks are quite varied, as you start off with 3 basic systems: a chain gun that has unlimited ammo, a set of bombs that arc and can be used to attack baddies above you or below you, as well as mines that will explode after a short amount of time. But as you go through the game, you'll also collect cash that you can spend between the levels, and buy new weapons and then customize your loadout. There are also specials that you'll find on your travels, and that can be a big help. The baddies are also quite the cast, as in the early sports themed world, you'll have to deal with balls and pitching machines, as well as the odd gopher. Unfortunately, there aren't any explosives that we can stuff down the gopher holes. The game also has a hidden menu that you can get by pressing the F keys. Now the main reason I bring this up is there's a team option for the controls, which will make player 1 control the body and player 2 control where you shoot. So with a bit of work, you can set up a twin stick shooter setup. Let's get our quack on next with Donk. Another game that I played the Amiga format demo of back when it was called Donk. And after what felt like ages, the game actually got released and had been renamed to Donk. And yes, the developers very much knew what they were doing with the name. But everything that I enjoyed in the demo was here, but just so much more of it as there was over 100 levels. This is a more standard Euro platformer, as you have to collect a set number of gems to open up the exit, at which point the level attempts to self-destruct and you have to race to the finish. Now there are hints of Super Mario World thrown in, as there's a map that changes as you go from one major area to another. But getting to these areas isn't that straightforward, as some levels have hidden exits. Now these thankfully can be gotten at almost any time, so you don't have to collect all the gems, but just because the exit is hidden doesn't mean it's not important, as sometimes you'll have to find that to actually make progress in the game. And as a general warning, the game can be quite difficult in places, mostly because there's more than a few instant deaths for you to deal with, even though our hero has a limited health system, which is indicated by the colour on the bar that you can see around the screen. Now this was added late and can cause some inconsistencies, as things that you might think will just hurt you can kill you outright, and others will just do some damage. Like drips from the ceiling or spiked floors. The order they do damage in, well, it might surprise you. Thankfully, there are power-ups that can help you out, like the shell or being able to fly around. Now, one of the things that set this game apart from others was that it supported both the original Amigas and the AGA powered ones from the same set of discs. And it just asks you when it starts which one you want. Now, this mostly means just adding some extra backgrounds to the AGA version, so it's not a huge change. They saved those for the CD32 edition, which made quite the number of changes. Some good and some bad. But for a more in-depth look at the game, then check out my review. Let's return to one of my earliest videos for K240. A game that I first played at a mate's, who had gotten it for some unknown reason, and he had absolutely no idea how to play it. So he lent me it, and after reading the thick manual and then really getting into it, I loved the game so much that I had to buy a copy. Now, in many ways this could be seen as the sequel to Utopia, as it's part city builder, part craft designer, and part strategy, as you have to build up these asteroids in a sector of space and then defend and expand as much as possible. And doing all that will put you in the path of alien races that are also around. The main reason for getting the asteroids is to mine them for their precious ore, and then sell them back to Tetracorp. Now, this will boost your finances. Or you can use it to build ships and missiles, so it is a bit of a balancing act, as is most parts of this game, because you'll need to grow your population on the asteroids, and that will require food, water and air, and a number of other amenities, all to keep them happy and working. And then these will then drive your mines into construction sites, but have too many of them and they can get restless. And while all this is going on, you'll have to explore the local space to find new asteroids to try and colonize. The transport ship that arrives every so often is your main contact with the wider galaxy, as it gives you the chance to sell on your ore, even if that does require a bit of micromanaging to get everything into one place. But being your main source of funding, it is worth the effort. It's also how you get upgrades, as you can buy them from SciTech, but they'll be delivered by the transport. And I always feel like I have to point out the UI in this game, as it is quite unique for the time, as it's all mouse driven, which was starting to become common, but most of the actions come up with a right click menu, and then you can drill down to the area you need. But if you hold down the mouse button, you can extract it out and add it to the main screen, so you can customize the buttons that you have on screen at all times. Now, I did make a video about this game, but it was a long time ago, so I really can't feel like I can recommend it. But what I can recommend is this game, as it's one that I keep coming back to. A game that took its time to arrive was Walker. Not to sound like a broken record, but yes, this is another game that I remember the demo fondly. But this time I did get to play it back in the day, even if it was a dodgy copy from a mate that would crash on the second world. But it left a lasting impression on me. Now, there is a long and convoluted story in the manual that talks about time wars and epic battles for the future. But what it really boils down to is having to use a big old walker to destroy everything and anything that gets in your way. But you do have to fight across multiple time zones, each of which looks different, but it has mostly similar sort of enemies. The controls are one of the more unique parts of the game, as you aim and attack with the mouse, but you move with the keyboard or joystick. Now this gives a huge amount of flexibility, but can be awkward depending on what type of joystick that you own. Now you really have one primary attack, and that's the twin cannons on the head of the walker. Now these have unlimited ammo, but you are limited in how long you can fire, as they will quickly overheat if you keep pouring on the bullets, so learning when to back off is key, or just using a quick burst attack every so often. It's also useful to know that the right mouse button will lock the cursor on the current target. Now this is great for attacking those faster moving targets, but you still have to be careful of holding down the left mouse button with the heat system. What is also relatively novel and unique at the time is the use of the pre-rendered graphics, as these formed the basis of the walker itself. Now this gave it quite the number of frames of animation, as well as giving that head quite a large range of movement, and it just looked absolutely great. As do the little soldiers and other things that try to attack you. It's so nicely animated, and they have lots of ways to try and get you, from artillery to trying to sneak up behind you and plant a bomb. It is just a shame that for the most part the gameplay doesn't really change up. There aren't any weapon upgrades or specials, it's just slightly different enemies and different backgrounds, and you just walking from right to left, shooting at anything and everything that will get in your way. Keeping with the smaller sprites, it's time to look at the Timekeepers. And you can see why I'm a fan of doing those cover disc face-off videos, as so many of my favourite games came from those discs. And yes, that includes this title. This was part of a budget label that Vulcan did with these cool little boxes. But this one could also be considered breaking the rules, as a revamped version of the game is currently available to buy from their website. But I think it was made much later on and it's digital only, so I think this sticks with the Amiga exclusive games. And in this one we have to guide our band of timekeepers around this top-down map to try and reach a goal. In many ways this could be considered a top-down Lemmings, but it's more Lemmings 2 than 1. As the number of keepers that you save on one map ends up in the next. And there are oh so many ways that a keeper can find its end, from walking into lava, or into a trap, or finding a not so friendly bit of local wildlife. To guide them around you'll use arrows and actions that you'll place on the ground. But you might have to first disable traps, or trigger something that'll open up a new path. So more often than not, you'll have to send out a small number of keepers first, to explore and solve the map so the rest can then make it to the exit safely. So careful planning, and sometimes a bit of blind panic when something jumps out at you is required. The levels can be quite demanding, as you might only get a single chance to solve some of the level's puzzles, and if you mess it up, well, it's time to reset and try again. As the name hints, this game is based on time travel, so you'll have multiple worlds that you'll have to visit, across various different time zones. And this will obviously affect the types of things that you'll have to deal with. I find this one of those small but well-formed puzzle games that will have you stumped for ages, but in a good way, because that solution, it will just eventually click and you'll know what to do. Vulcan did quite a few Amiga-only titles, including the Valhalla series, that used a very similar art style, or other oddities like Hill C Lido, but of all their games that could have made this list, this is the one that I keep returning to. Next we take on the Breed in Alien Breed 3D. Now this was a game that I'd known about but never really played, as I saw all the pictures in the magazines but I didn't have an A1200. So it wasn't until my Amiga Answers to Doom video that I really gave it the time that it deserved. And this was a bit of a special game, as it's a fun first-person shooter for the Amiga. Now it might have required a machine far more powerful than my A500, and being honest, it actually needed more powerful machine than a stock A1200 that most people would have had at the time, as yes, extra RAM and maybe a little bit more CPU power will help out massively. Even if you didn't have that, it was still quite nice. And at the time, I think this was one of the closest the Amiga ever got to having a proper Doom style game, as we had levels with height and key cards, and even platforms over rooms. And this really lovely water effect that was going on as well. But the small game window and huge border tends to be one of the sticking points in the game. And while you can make it full screen, it's pixel doubled up to that size, so it doesn't really increase the quality of the image, just how much you can see. But it also removes any indication of how much health you have, or your ammo or keys, so it is a bit of a trade-off when you use it. But thankfully there are a decent range of guns, but the ammo amounts, well, they can be quite small. This game does seem to have a touch of horror with its level design, so you end up having to juggle between all your various guns. And I still think the explosives look far more powerful than they actually are. But those bouncing grenades are so very cool, even if a bit tricky to get a handle on. And the game will even give you some lovely moments to be able to rain them down onto the monsters. The levels can be a bit maze-like, and tend to be a bit enclosed, particularly when compared to say Doom. But they do some fun things with it. And there's also a few bosses for you to deal with, and these can be quite tricky with the level designs, and how big the bosses themselves actually are. The rest of the baddies, they can be fun, even if a little too similar to the Doom staples, as they don't really feel like something we would have seen in Alien Breed. But overall, this is a fun game, with some interesting level designs and some particularly cool tech. The next title is also our newest, as it's Tiny Little Slug. Released in the far off future date of 2020, I spotted this while ordering some other parts and figured I'd give that a go, as it came boxed and it looked quite interesting, and it turned out to be a lovely little game, as it's almost like a Metroidvania style thing, which wasn't all that well represented on the Amiga. But this was also meant to be played in a single sitting. There's no saving, but you do have unlimited lives, as well as quite a lot of checkpoints. So if you have the time, you can keep going and complete it. Even if that does require you to have the skills to be able to do it, as there are a few tricky moments. As when you start, you're nothing but a basic tiny little slug, but you're trying to get that nice, ripe strawberry. But unfortunately, you fall down. And to get back to it, well, you're gonna have to talk to people and help them out, as well as discover new skills, like being able to jump. Now you aren't completely helpless when you start, as you can climb up walls or along the ceilings, so you still have to do a lot of platforming to get on. The action is spread across 4 large worlds, with lots of critters and obstacles for you to avoid and work around. Now this was released on the original Amigas as well as the CD32, but there's no real difference between them, outside of it obviously running on the CD32. But the game looks quite nice even in its original version, that I think trying to improve the graphics might have actually taken away from it, as I've seen some games that added extra colours and it didn't work. The game was designed with speedrunning in mind, and as such it doesn't have a score table but a timetable. And it also happens that if you have an internet equipped machine, you can upload your times. Now I've not actually managed to finish the game yet, as it is quite tricky. But I could also say that about quite a few other titles on this list. But the real point is that I enjoy them enough that I keep coming back to them time and time again, and that is what I really look for in a game. And finally, let's look at Premiere. A game that I got from a friend of the family, because it wouldn't run on his fancy new A1200, but it ran great on our 500 Plus. And I was always happy that he ended up giving it to us, because this is a great game, from the wonderfully animated intro to the game itself. This might be one of the best animated games around, and it's clear that this was from the same team that made the Heimdall games. It has their graphical stamp on it, and unlike their other games, this was a platformer that is also slightly difficult to place in a box. It has this real great feeling of exploring as you dig into the level, but it's really far more linear than it might seem, as you have to pull these switches to open up other areas. But it's just those areas might be further into the level than you might realise, so you might get to it, find a dead end, and then have to backtrack to find that missing switch. That might have just been in the opposite direction to where you went, or it might have been on the other side of the set, as all of this is based on movie sets, with the first obviously being Western movies. But you can travel behind the facades to get to the back lots, and you'll have to do this all through the game as you travel around the level. And it seems these studios don't really like you, or at least their actors, as everyone is out to get you, but you aren't completely at their mercy, as you can throw a punch, even if its range is quite limited, roll down some stairs, but to be honest, more often than not, you'll want to find the ammo, and it'll have a unique attack per world. For the Westerns, it's dynamite, where for the black and white, it's bags of sand, or it could be a laser gun. Now I've not even mentioned yet the game's unique hook, even though you've probably seen it a few times already, and that is the play area is across two planes, and you can jump between them at will. There is also the bosses. These are also quite themed and typically unique, like having to do a quick draw against a bulldog, or using a rail cart to outrun a train. And there we have it, my current favourite exclusive Amiga games. And I do mean current, as who knows what I might find in the future. The Cover Disc and Amiga Answer 2 series have both been great in showing me new games that I hadn't played before. And there's a few that I know of, but I never really got around to playing them. And who knows, they may come up as my future favourite titles. And if you have any recommendations of your own, then leave them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, then YouTube law requires me to mention the buttons below. Just do with them as you wish. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was an assortment box of favourites, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I do hope that if you made it this far into the video, you enjoyed it, as I had a lot of fun making this one, as it was a great excuse to play some absolutely amazing games. And hopefully you'll check out a few of them as well. Or you might want to watch a few of my other videos. There should be 2 of them on the screen right now if I remembered to add them.